Recording in progress.
Okay, hi everyone. Okay, it's 9 o'clock. And I saw something today in the news, in the New York Times, that relates to our debate topic that we had on Friday with Katya, I should say, and highlighting how, in this report by Roger Cohen, who's I should say, he's the New York Times bureau chief in Paris, and he is a very Euro-Atlantic, pro-American benign hegemony a journalist, and very much in favor of American influence and very much favoring American aims and objectives, including intense support for Israel. is highlighting how today is, of course, May 9th, Victory Day in Moscow, in Russia, the day that commemorates the defeat of Nazi Germany and the occupation of Berlin by the Soviet Union, and the 27 million people, more or less, that died in the Soviet Union as a consequence of the German invasion. And and so there's been a lot of speculation about what Putin will do or what will declare or announce in relationship to his war in Ukraine, to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in the context of this intensely emotional, powerful, symbolic event, when, again, Putin is justifying the invasion of Ukraine in terms of fighting Nazism, fighting the fascists who they defeated in World War II, and to claim that that Russia is invading Ukraine in order to eliminate fascist tendencies within that young state that emerged 30 years ago with the breakup of the Soviet Union, and claiming that fascists or fascist tendencies are threatening the Russian minority in Ukraine, or the Russian people in Ukraine, or even trying to go beyond that and argue that Ukraine, with the assistance of NATO and the European Union, is basically trying to brainwash all of the people in Ukraine to believe that they're not Russians, that they should be opposed to Russian influence, and those individuals who want to defend and maintain their Russian identity and therefore their allegiance with Moscow are threatened. So these are all the justifications that the Russian government is using for its invasion. And I'm not going to go through the whole article here. I've just summarized what the article is about. But of course, today is May 9th, so Russia is 5 or 6 hours behind here, us in South Korea. So what will happen, or what Putin will announce, will be, if he announces anything, will be announced later on today during the celebrations of the Victory Day parade in Moscow. And just to highlight here that how this is, again, instigating or inspiring or motivating or calling more attention to, political attention to, the European integration process, or Europeanization. And so Roger Cohen, the journalist, notes here that the war in Ukraine has galvanized Europe. It generally views with urgency bringing Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova into the European Union. And let me make sure you're able to see this, because sometimes the computer's not fully accurate here. Into the European Union. So Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova into the European Union. Calls, by the way, I should mention that it seems to be, according to the media sense, that Sweden and Finland are definitely going to apply to join NATO. They're already in the European Union, but now they're also going to join NATO, or at least apply to join NATO. But to also that Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova are going to join the European Union. Calls are multiplying for an acceleration of decision-making on foreign and domestic and defense policy. Mario Draghi, the former European Central Bank director, who is now Prime Minister of Italy, the Italian Prime Minister, called this month for pragmatic federalism in defense and other areas. And of course, that term federalism relates to our debate topic on Friday about whether or not moving towards a United States of Europe is a utopian and therefore a dangerous vision or objective. Federalism, a word associated with the idea of a United States of Europe, eventually under a federal government of some kind, suggests fast-forwarding European unity in ways that have seemed unthinkable for many years. And he goes on here, we must overcome this principle of unanimity, which leads to a logic of crossed vetoes, and move towards decisions taken by a qualified majority, Mr. Draghi said, alluding to a procedure that would allow approval of European common foreign security policy in European defense and security policy proposals, instead of requiring everybody in the European Union at least to accept or acquiesce to the proposals, that there could be approved new proposals by qualified majority voting. And so it goes on here, alluding to a procedure that would allow approval once a certain threshold of support is attained. he added, protecting Ukraine means protecting ourselves and the project of security and democracy we have built together over 70 years. So currently, as we mentioned earlier, when the Maastricht Treaty was ratified in 2003, it formally recognized three different pillars of European integration. One is the established European Community pillar, which focuses on creating the single market and economic and monetary union. But then there were two other pillars or columns as foundational pillars for the European integration that were identified officially and formally in the Maastricht Treaty. And one was, of course, the Common and Foreign Security Policy pillar, and the other one was Justice and Home Affairs. And those two pillars in Justice and Home Affairs and Common Foreign Security Policy still overwhelmingly required unanimous consent among all the member states of the European Union to adopt policies that involve, for example, developing and deploying military force on behalf of the European Union, or coming up with common immigration policies for the European Union. Highly politically sensitive topics that evoke or are vulnerable to evoking nationalist hostility and resentment within the member states. When you start talking about sending European soldiers from Germany or Italy or Greece to go potentially go fight and die and kill in combat, this is going to generate, may potentially generate a hostile, intense response within the member states. So common foreign and security policy and justice and home affairs, those two pillars were primarily still requiring unanimous consent by all the member states before policies in those two areas could be adopted and implemented in the name of the European Union. So Mario Draghi is calling for qualified majority voting, which now prevails in most of the European Union's business, because 80% of the European Union's business is the first pillar, which is European Community, policy for business and economic integration. That is overwhelmingly decided, those policies in that area, by qualified majority voting, right? That the European Parliament is an equal participant in voting along with the Council of the European Union, or the Council of Ministers, in which the Council of the Ministers of the European Union meet, and they vote by qualified majority voting. They do not all officially have to agree to a policy under in the Pillar 1 of the European Community in terms of economic and business integration. And that's about 80% of European Union law is in the area of economics and business. So it's really important. And the official name for that qualified majority voting procedure and the necessity of European Parliament approval was given a name under the Lisbon Treaty in 2009 as the quote unquote ordinary procedure. That's the official name of qualified majority voting and European Parliament participation requirement for approval to adopt policy in economic community policymaking. And there has been some move to shift more of the foreign policy and border control policy to the ordinary procedure, but it's been slow. Well, it's been slow in foreign policy. There has been more efforts to develop immigration policy in the context of the ordinary procedure, the ordinary decision-making procedure under the European Community, in which, again, the Council of Ministers adopts policies by qualified majority voting and the European Parliament has to approve, moving migration and border policy to that ordinary procedure, because the justification being, in part, that of course, we're talking about free movement of labor. And of course, you cannot really have a single market unless you also have free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor as well, the four freedoms of the European Community. And so there's been this effort to move justice and home affairs to the ordinary procedure. And even when the European Union adopts immigration policies under the name of the European Union, it's been difficult to implement those policies because, as we mentioned, even though, for example, with the immigration crisis in 2015 and 2016 into Europe, the European Union, using majority voting, qualified majority voting, decided that all the member states in the European Union, including Hungary and Poland, had to take some portion of migrants, some number of migrants coming into the European Union through Greece and through Italy, that Hungary, Poland, all of these countries had to take some number, and the number was determined according to some formula. And it was approved that this would be how the burden dealing with this challenge of these hundreds of thousands of migrants coming into the European Union would be distributed among all the member states. And Hungary has simply refused to implement the policy. They refuse to take these migrants coming predominantly from North Africa and Asia. And for years now, the European Union, and particularly the European Commission, has been discussing or pressuring or trying to pressure Hungary to fulfill its European Union obligations. But Viktor Orban and the Hungarians say, no, we don't support this policy. And so there has been talk about how to pressure or push Viktor Orban and the Fidesz party government that he controls in Hungary to implement its requirements under the European Union. And it's just been mostly talk since then. And of course, we've had other crises that have overwhelmed this 2015, 2016 immigration crisis since then, including now, for example, the war in Ukraine. But here you see Mario Draghi, the Prime Minister of Italy, calling for qualified majority voting to be used in coming up with common security and defense policies for the European Union. And again, it's in the context of this current crisis regarding the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so he's saying we have to overcome this principle of unanimity in common and foreign security policy decision-making. And so this article goes on. Germany's coalition government under Chancellor Olaf Scholz supports majority voting on security and defense policy, but supposedly France is more hesitant. He goes on, Roger Cohen writes, Russian aggression has shifted Poland towards support for strengthening the union. And Mr. Macron's defeat of Marine Le Pen, the nationalist friend of Mr. Putin, in the presidential election last month has isolated the illiberal Hungarian leader Viktor Orban in his connivance with Russia because he has good economic relations with Russia and Russian business people, Russian oligarchs. The European Union, always querulous, seems bent on transformative change. So before I go on to the next comment, I should also remember that we need to have the smart attendance, so we don't forget this. So let me do that now. Start attendance, and your number is 956. 956 is your smart attendance number, so let me go to 956 is the smart attendance number, and there you go. Okay, so that is done. So this has all been introduction to a topic that I wanted to introduce, and that is your final take-home paper, your final examination paper. And so here is your final exam paper, which follows the same format as the midterm paper. And let me make sure I'm sharing the screen for that as well. And here you see, after studying the class material, please critique the following statement. A dominant, shared, perceived dangerous threat is a necessary, if not sufficient, precondition for permanent deepening and broadening of Europeanization. So this week and the subsequent weeks for this semester, this word Europeanization is in the title of all the chapters you're reading. Most of the chapters, if not all the chapters you are reading. And so is it necessary to have a shared common threat from Moscow or from China or from global climate change, from some political threat, perceived threat from radical political militant movements in the Middle East? Is it necessary to have a dominant, shared, perceived dangerous threat is a necessary precondition for the permanent deepening and broadening of Europeanization, meaning European Union integration, which, you know, again, the end point of that is some kind of federalism, typically. So that's your final exam paper, and we will follow the same format that we followed for the midterm paper. Please use and cite information from at least 3 different chapters, from chapters 12 through 19, because we're starting off with chapter, since the midterm, with chapter 12, and then the last chapter in the book is chapter 19. Use and cite at least 3 different chapters text from the textbook, information from 3 different chapters, at least 3 different chapters, to critique this statement. A dominant shared perceived dangerous threat is a necessary, if not sufficient, precondition for permanent deepening and broadening of Europeanization. Can Europe only exist if it has an enemy, if it has an adversary that is shared or perceived by all the power centers, or most of the power centers in the European Union? And you saw how Mario Draghi, Prime Minister of Italy, is now calling for European pragmatic federalism in making European common foreign and security policy in response to the crisis in Ukraine. So is that evidence that, yes, this is true? And so, of course, we will have the same format that we've adopted before, namely that I will meet with you. Well, you submit a paper, you'll submit a draft by Saturday, 4th of June, to Cyber Campus. I'll write comments and send it back to you, and then we will meet individually, either in my office or on Zoom, depending what you prefer, to discuss the comments on my draft. And then you will submit the final draft due no later than Saturday, June 18th. So that is your final exam take-home paper, okay? And if anybody has any questions, they can of course ask them. I'll try to check the chat if I can to find the questions. If not, you can unmute yourself and ask through your computers. Okay, so that is the final exam take-home paper. And so let's go back and look at the notes for this week so that we can begin to cover those notes. And let me open up the notes and make sure I'm opening up the right notes. And so we go here, and you see here are the notes that I have posted on the Cyber Campus. And so again, let me think about how I can hold this microphone in a way right here at the same time as I'm having both hands available to work on the screen here. What is democracy all about? What is the essence of democracy? Participation, political participation. And maybe that's the essence of what the modern world is about, that more and more people become aware within their communities that politics makes their lives, that politics shapes their environment and determines their fate. And so when people become more and more aware of the fact that human beings make this world, not supernatural forces, but human beings themselves make this world, that determine their own fate and their own well-being, they want to participate in politics to shape the policies and the rulers over their communities. And this participation is acknowledged by this concept of democracy. Democracy means rule by the people. In other words, that the population, the citizenry within the community is supposed to be ultimate authority in making the government policy and determining who the government will be in a community. And but what is the real essence of democracy? How do people participate? Well, of course, voting is one way by which people participate in democracy. But other ways people can participate include organizing themselves and participating in collective efforts to pressure and shape the political system, pressure the political leaders, the government authorities to get what they want, maybe on an immediate level, like economic groups, business people, steel manufacturers, for example, forming a trade association to lobby and pressure the European Union institutions, not to mention their own national governments, to get favorable policies for European steel producers who are threatened by what they claim is unfair competition from Chinese steel producers, for example. You can come up with an infinite number of examples. Or something more long-term, social movements. Social movements are also organized efforts involving a number of collective interest groups working together to maintain and sustain pressure on the authorities, on the government, to get what they want. And typically what they want, includes material benefits, but it also wants something typically more fundamental than immediate transactional benefits. That social movements seek to change the prevailing attitudes and values within the society. So when we think about the feminist movement, for example, what does the feminist movement want? Of course, the feminist movement wants equality for women, policies to end sexual harassment in the workplace, whereby authorities use the economic authorities in a company use their power and position to pressure women for sexual favors and punish them if they do not get their benefits from what they want from these women, and that's wrong, right? So they want policies adopted to stop that, but they also fundamentally aim to change prevailing notions in societies about stereotypes that people have or prevail within those societies regarding men, women, people that are non-binary. They want to change prevailing perceptions, attitudes, and values. So it's not just about economic benefits, typically, although economic benefits obviously are very, very important. I mean, 80% of my social interaction, 80% of your social interaction is in the economic area, in the area of our careers. You know, why we get paid. We get paid to do a job, and you need money to survive. So I don't want to undercut the importance of economic policies and policies that aim to protect people's from sexual harassment, because sexual harassment also leads to economic punishment of women who do not respond to pressure from their boss for sexual benefits, sexual favors. But they want, it's something also more fundamental, that these social movements are trying to change prevailing stereotypes that have emerged over many years, maybe even generations, and that people typically assume is normal. Like it's just normal that, of course, you know, people are going to run into other people at their job of where they work and their place of employment, and it's acceptable or not unexpected that, for example, a boss would be interested in a woman that's working for him, and may want to pursue that, and that is a traditional stereotype or view as being quote unquote normal. And social movements want to change that perception that that is normal and therefore to be tolerated, to be accepted, that that's just the way the world is. Social movements want to challenge that. So what has been the impact of European integration on these social movements and interest groups? Has European integration really changed the activity of these feminist movements, for example, in Germany or Italy or Scandinavia as a consequence of European integration? And it's an important topic because it goes back to this notion of what is the meaning of liberal democracy, of democracy in which we allow people to organize themselves and pressure and appeal and pressure their authorities to change policies or adopt policies and fundamentally to change society itself. The essence of participation. And of course, the European Union is supposed to be all about democracy and participation, right? So, so what's been going on in terms of European integration? How does European integration affect the feminist movement in these different countries? How has it affected the feminist movements, for example, in these different countries? And of course, the answer is that it's complex, it's complicated. But these interest groups and social movements are an important topic of study. And the European Union is shaping the political environment or context within which these social movements, and there's many different social movements, right? We keep mentioning feminist social movements, but the green environmentalist movement, or the LGBTQ movement, or the abortion access, legal access movement, or conservative populist movements that demand, for example, that the values of the Catholic Church that were supposedly suppressed under communism, that those be expressed within the new democratic Poland, because that represents the essence of Polish national characteristics. Social movements can be right-wing, conservative, populist, as well as left-wing and progressive and pro-change, right? So that's an important point to keep in mind. So yes, what can we say about the European Union's impact and Europeanization's impact on social movements and interest organizations? And yes, the European Union creates new opportunities and policies which do incentivize or affect the behavior and strategies and formations of these interest groups and social movements. But they include, of course, transactional groups like banks and chemical industries, as well as women's lobbies and environmental organizations and farmers' unions have all decided to represent their interest in Brussels. So with European integration, if you're a German farmers' union or a French farmers' union, we see that with European integration of the economy, that these different farmers' unions or environmental organizations, they are going to focus more and more of their attention in getting what they want in terms of policies by focusing more and more on the European Union institutions headquartered in Brussels, Belgium. And this evidence of their focus on headquarters in Brussels, Belgium, is when they rent an office and establish an office and pay money and hire lobbyists to work in that Brussels office, right? So that's a concrete evidence that they think this is a valuable way to spend some of their resources. They've got to lobby in Brussels. And of course, they do this not because they just want to promote European integration, because they do it because they want to get what they want. And typically, that's a theme in this book. Still, the focus of these interest groups and social movements is still overwhelmingly on the member state governments, right? European integration has not shifted overwhelmingly in tremendous fashion the focus of these interest groups on their national governments. It's still on the national governments because the national governments are more immediate and more powerful in shaping the policy reality of Germans living in Germany or people living in France, right? And so European integration is utilized to help put more pressure on the national state governments. Globalization processes, internal organizational changes, and transformations of their domestic environment all affect social movements and interest groups, but they also have to consider the construction of European Union processes. So, of course, they respond to these processes. They try to forecast where they're moving. If I were, for example, a German or a French or an Italian arms manufacturer, a company that makes weapons for military, I am probably going to be paying close attention to this call for more European integration because it's going to have an impact potentially on my business, obviously. If the European Union is going to spend a lot more money and the member states are going to spend a lot more money on the military, on the German military, for example, then we want to shape how the European Union is going to play a role in deciding how to buy and contract out and supply European Union militaries. I mean, that's been a topic in the news reports, for example. You might have noticed that the German government has announced it's going to increase its military expenditures by 100 billion euros. That the German government is going to spend 100 billion more euros, I guess, per year on its military, which is woefully, supposedly, very badly equipped today. And so what's the impact going to be? How are you going to supply those German military forces? And now that, of course, European Union has been encouraging manufacturing companies to set up and construct manufacturing chains and business relationships across the countries of the European Union. How are we going to impact, how was the German commitment to spending 100 billion euros on the German military going to impact manufacturers in Italy, in France, and all these other countries that are supplying these corporations that are contractors, subcontractors to these bigger corporations that are going to provide and deliver the new tanks and ships and planes to Europe. And all of these questions have to be determined and shaped by your national government policy making, but also European government policy, European level policy making by European institutions because of 70 years of European integration. So, of course, the European construction, the construction of Europe has material consequences, but also populist reactionary consequences. There are some groups within these societies that are hostile to European integration, and they have become more active as a consequence of European integration. So how that will impact these social movements and interest groups, that's also very important, right? Populist reaction against European integration is going to shape the activity of these social movements and interest groups, for example, in Poland. And of course, some kind of position has to be taken by example, for example, by the Catholic Church in Poland. Is the Catholic Church in Poland going to fight directly Brussels and the European Union as the European Union attempts to insist that, for example, gays should not be discriminated against and being hired in jobs in Polish towns and villages, not to mention the big cities? So these are all considerations that, you know, conservative populist social movements and interest groups in Poland has to consider because that's part of the environment, the political environment created by European integration. And so it goes on to note here that by this author that the impact of European integration has been differential across the interest groups and the social movements that has influenced. I mean, the European Union has tried to be, particularly, for example, a leader in promoting environmental protection policies and environmentalism as one of the brand images of the European Union. The European Union stands for global climate protection against man-made climate change. So that is going to affect, obviously, the environmental movements and interest groups in all of the member states. And there has been, of course, no single collective action form or single interest group intermediation type has emerged. Again, highlighting again that European integration has not homogenized, is not homogenizing the member states. The member states have their way of interest groups and social movements forming and behaving and interacting with the government, and Europeanization has made that interaction more complicated or more complex and provided more opportunities for pressuring the member states, but still has not produced one form or one, has not evidenced the push towards a standard European tendency towards homogenization of how interest groups and social movements act in European Union member states. They still act in a German way or a French way, an Italian way. It may be with European characteristics, but it's still fundamentally an Italian way or French way or German way of intermediating between the government and the interest groups. And on the other hand, all interest groups and social movements face the increasing incentive to coordinate their interest representation at different levels of EU governance with some empirical regularity. So they establish offices in Brussels, and particularly if, like in Germany, there is a strong tradition and constitutional protection for the rights of the government lenders, the provinces in Germany, to play an important role in policy making, then the interest groups and the social movements will also, of course, focus their lobbying and pressuring and contentious politics on those provincial entities, on those provincial states, and they will use European integration as a way by which to pressure those regional governments and lobby those regional governments to get what they want. But again, it goes back to the nature of Germany. Germany is a federal republic, and the German states, the Lands or Länder in German, they have tremendous power, autonomy and power according to the German constitution. So if you're going to work for protection of women's rights in Germany, you've got to focus on the Länder as well as on the national government in Berlin. And that means incorporating how the European Union views the regional governments in Germany will, of course, shape your political strategies as a social movement or an interest group. So the first thing that this writer does, and this author is, I think, Saruger, that sounds like a German name. I'm not certain. I can't recall if she is a German. She says that she's not going to make a very strong distinction between interest groups and social movements. And, you know, that's an interesting statement that she makes. Typically, there is a significant differentiation between social movements versus interest groups. Typically, you know, social movements, for example, are understood to be coalitional alliances of interest groups that institutionalize in order to generate sustained pressure through by this coalition or constellation of interest groups to get what they want. So, you know, feminists are going to work with LGBTQ and other groups, interest groups, to change German or Italian or French society to get their policies and also respect and dignity within the society. So that's typically how social movements are understood. But she says, for the purposes of her analysis, she's not going to make that strong differentiation because they all are pressuring or lobbying government authorities. And she says, when you look at the distinction between so-called interest groups that pursue economic or other material selfish self-interests on the one hand, versus others that claim to be working on human rights issues, social justice issues, human and political justice issues as social movements, of course, even those groups that are advocating for economic interests, they always articulate and express their economic interests as part of the greater good. I mean, if you're a European farmer, right, and you're lobbying the French government and European Union institutions for the benefit of farmers and French farmers, you're going to advocate what you want for French farmers in terms of economic well-being as being good, not just for French farmers, but being good for everybody, good for all of the French and all of Europe. And you'll make statements about, you'll probably make statements about how Europe needs to have the ability to feed itself in case there's danger, how French farmers are engaged in environmentally protective policies to protect the environment in their farming practices, that supporting and subsidizing French farmers through the European Union and the French government protects the European and global environment. So I think that's the point that Saruger is making, that these interest groups, they never say, I want for me what's good for me, only in terms of what's good for me. They always are justifying what they want in terms of material economic interests as being part of some greater social or economic justice or human rights objective. And they do that because they want to have support. They want to convince you to support their demands for the French farmers or the German farmers or the Italian farmers as being good, not just for those farmers, it's good for everybody. It's good for the world. So you see, in fact, that the political behavior of both these interest groups and social movements tends to be very similar. Both frame their interests in terms of the common good. Both have specific interests that they want to defend, because even these social movements, you know, they have typically concrete policies they want adopted. If you're a feminist, right, you're going to advocate, we want, you know, maternity leave, and we want health care, daycare for our children, so our children can go to school, so we can go to and be taken care of, while the women are able to therefore pursue careers. They have concrete specific policy demands that they want to satisfy, as well as wanting to challenge, you know, heteropatriarchal traditional notions of the traditional heterosexual male dominance of the family and society. And their survival, of course, is the most common, smallest common denominator. So social movements need resources, and these social movements, you know, for whether they be environmental social movements or feminist social movements or LGBTQ social movements, they also need support, material support, and so they're also focused on getting access to funds and as other resources as well within the European Union, but they need resources. just like these other interest groups are lobbying for resources. And so Ruger calls them non-state actors. And there are two critical features characterize these non-state actors. There are strategies that they adopt. Also, they call them action repertoires, namely that, again, action repertoire means they're like actors on a stage, right? And we're supposed to watch them. Even if I'm not a French farmer is going to try to appeal to me and you to support them. So they're going to make appeals and engage in drama and make rhetorical appeals to you and me to support them. Action repertoires. And also important is their degree of organizational structure. How effective are they in organizing and mobilizing their members to act when the leadership of these interest groups and social movements call upon them to act and coordinate their pressure in their political voting and political behavior to pressure national and European and local governments. Of course, some of these interest groups have more connections. They're more established, obviously, within the European Union, so they can focus more on providing expertise and knowledge. And of course, to the European Union and national governments. And that's, of course, a feature of lobbying by interest groups in developed societies everywhere. That, you know, if I'm a German policymaker or a European Union policymaker that's somehow has an impact on the development of policies affecting European arms production, who knows more about European arms production than European arms producers? Of course they have the information, they have the data, they have the knowledge, they have the interest that makes them concerned. And so I, as a officially, I am not part of the European company, I still want to pay close attention to what the European arms manufacturers are saying, or the German steel manufacturers, or the German farmers, or the French farmers, or the European farmers in general, because I'm supposed to work with them for the betterment of the well-being of France, Germany, and Europe overall. And that means I don't want to be their adversary. I need them, just like they need me. I need them. They have the knowledge, they have the expertise, and so keep in mind, you know, lobbying is not a bad thing. Lobbying is an essential part of democratic participation. And of course, in these incredibly complex early 21st century developed economies, you need expertise and knowledge if you're in the government or the European Union institutions, and these non-state actors have that expertise and knowledge. They tend to be highly centralized and well-organized, and collective actors are more typically present here. And then there are outside strategies, new interest groups, new social movements trying to challenge the established status quo. And of course, this is the more supposed progressive and leftist movements that are attempting to change the traditional patterns and of behavior and the traditional networks, and trying to impact them. And of course, because they want to typically, you know, require, for example, that European companies and take more into consideration environmental protection, that means attempting to change the standard way that these European non-state actors and European and national and local governments interact with each other. And so typically, again, but they only can have this impact if they're able to appeal to a broader section of society to get the society's support. So again, that means, again, these action repertoires. You can't do much in modern politics unless you have public opinion support. Public opinion support. And that means you have to provoke the public to consider this issue as an issue that many people may not have thought about. Like, what does it mean, animal rights? I mean, that's a big focus in European Union policymaking. The rights of animals that are being raised to be slaughtered and consumed as part of the food industry. People think about that. How am I going to try to make them think about that? How am I going to encourage these people to think about the well-being of animals as an interest that they hadn't concerned about after they'd grown up eating beef and pork and chicken their entire lives, right? So, and that means you have to generate public opinion sympathy and support. And that means action repertoires. Okay, so interest groups and social movements use these action repertoires interchangeably. For example, Greenpeace, the big environmental international interest group, social movement, focusing on environmental issues, and farmers unions use these action repertoires interchangeably. Say that European farming must be protected from American farming imports because agricultural imports because the European farmers are more focused on environmentally protective good farming practices that cost a little more money, but if we keep doing it the American way, if we do it the American way, then the world and European and world environment is endangered. That kind of action repertoire appeals. Business organizations such as Business Europe, the European Federation of Industrialists may be more prone to engage almost exclusively inside lobbying, right? That the interest corporations, of interest groups consisting of established big businesses, they already have access. They already have established institutional mechanisms for appealing to European policymakers at the national, local, and European level. And so we don't hear about them so much because they're not trying to get access as an outsider. Social movements are more likely to employ protest strategies such as marches for the unemployed and farmers as well, of course, and other established business individual groups that are involving lots of people. They will also engage in protest strategies, for example, to protect, as I mentioned, European farmers and so on. So we should place interest groups and social movements along a continuum rather than make a clear distinction between them. And that's kind of a controversial statement that Saruder has made, but that's how she is going to approach this, this topic. Interest groups and social movements are organizations. Their members may be formal or informal. Of course, the more formal they are, the more likely they are to be organized. But some social movements show a high degree of hierarchical organizations or are distinguishable from interest groups only by name. So some social movements, they have formal organizational members and hierarchies, and because we have this vision that somehow social movements are amorphous, general social pressures, and that's often true, but some of these social movements, they have a high degree of a hierarchical organization. Like, for example, organizations that focus on environmental protection, for example, or as I mentioned, the protection of the rights of animals. So we should place them along a continuum rather than viewing them as two distinct types of actors. What about Europeanization of interests and strategies? Whether or not national interest groups or Europeanize their lobbying strategies, in other words, really focus on European Union institutions like the Commission, the European Parliament, the Council of Ministers, depends upon the resources available to these non-state actors along with their domestic and institutional context. So, you know, it costs money to rent an office in Brussels and hire a staff to work there and become experts. European integration affects all groups, both states, interest groups, and social movements. And how to understand this focus on how to process and implement these pressures and demands from these social movements. There have been different theoretical frameworks adopted. Pluralism is the one that dominates in the United States. For example, the people form interest groups and pressure them. Statism or neocorporatism highlights more the role of the state authorities in shaping and determining what the actual policy impact of these interest groups will be. In other words, this perspective of neocorporatism really gives a lot of authority to the role of the state government institutions themselves. That those are the main focus, the critical focus for understanding what the impact of interest groups and social movements will be. You need social groups, you need social movements and interest groups, but to understand their impact, you need to focus upon the nature of the state in France and Germany and the development of the state at the European Union level through the Europeanization process. But today is our short class, and so that's it for today, okay? So I will post the the final exam on the cyber campus after class today, and I will be in touch with you to see you on Friday. Okay? Bye.